Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 35 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes. And with me is a man who is always in my frame of reference and hopefully I'm in his, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you, Ken?
I am very well, Rory. You are always in my frame of reference. And thank you. I think that is such a kind thing to say to someone. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to hold that and own it today. What a great day. Just before we came on to do the recording, we were just having a look and seeing how's the podcast doing. 62 5-star reviews on iTunes. We're just so grateful. We're overwhelmed by your generosity and kindness to take your time and just go and leave those reviews. Thank you so much. Over 100,000 downloads worldwide of the Counselling Tutor Podcast in just 34 episodes. We're blown away. Thank you to all of you.
Yes. Thank you very much. We're really grateful. And we're really grateful about the feedback we get when we publish them on the social media feeds, our Facebook feed. And if you want to join our Facebook feed, if you just type in Facebook, Counselling Tutor, you'll find us. We're a closed group, but no problem. Just knock on the door, press knock, and we'll let you in. And you can join over 4,000 like-minded people who are studying or have a passion of the world of counselling and psychotherapy.
Yeah. So I guess if we need to keep doing what we're doing, Rory, and deliver value. And today is no exception. Great episode for episode 34. We're going to be kicking off with speaking about equality and diversity. It's something that comes around again and again in counselling. However, we're going to turn it on its head. So more about that in a second. It's not just going to be the old equality and diversity debate. We're going to take a different angle on that. Theory with Rory today, we're starting to drill down. So we know about the necessary and conditioned, what am I talking about? Necessary and sufficient conditions of Carl Rogers in person-centered therapy. But I think it's time that we really drill deep into each one individually. And today, Rory, you're going to be speaking about psychological contact.
It is, and it's interesting we started this episode by saying you're in my frame of reference and I'm in yours.
Yeah.
That is the basis of psychological contact, isn't it? And it's really fascinating that when Rogers put his idea forward in that famous 1951 paper published in the American Journal of Consulting Psychology, that he really laid the ground for what would become one of the monumental therapies of the 20th century. He laid the ground for it. And it's noticeable through the years, everybody knows about the core conditions of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, a term Rogers never used himself.
Yeah.
He used that. And the hidden conditions people kind of know about. But one that kind of gets overlooked is psychological contact. And I think it's a misrepresented and misunderstood concepts. And I'm going to kind of investigate in my Theory with Rory section what psychological contact is, how it can be viewed, and also about how we may not get psychological contact, things we might not think about. And I'm going to do a super handout to help people with that as well.
Oh, I love the Rory super handouts. I've got them all, and they're so downloaded, so you'll be able to get that. We'll give the link to that a little bit later on in today's session of the Theory with Rory. And then we're going to be ending today. Rory and I are going to be kicking around an idea that has been around as long as there has been counselling and therapy, and that is the idea of crying within the therapy room, the invite to cry, tissues in the therapy room. Should they be displayed? How do we handle this? What do we do when a client cries? So we're going to be visiting that, but we're going to kick off with equality and diversity, and we said we were going to stand this on its head. So we train as counsellors, as psychotherapists. We learn all about equality and diversity so we can be there for whoever it is that comes in without judgment, unconditionally valuing them as a person. What about when it's the other way around? What about when you are the one being judged as the counsellor for your gender, the way you present yourself, your weight, your age? It's an interesting concept that a client may come in judging us.
It is, Ken. And we're very grateful to one of our forum contributors, Becky Slacker, who's brought this up. Before me and Ken go on air, we have a bit of an editorial meeting, and we talk about the topics that we're going to talk about. And this one came up, and we felt it was really important. And Becky was writing in our Facebook group that she felt there was a lot of judgments from agencies and maybe training providers about age. And Becky she kind of self-evaluates herself as young, and she looks young. This is what she said, and she wonders how that works. And when Ken and myself taught, it did come up, didn't it? There were times when it came up, and I can think of one learner who a client said, "You look too young."
Yeah,
you look too young, and it is fascinating. My view is that if there's an agency that's taking people on, they should abide by the Equalities Act.
Yep.
In this country, we've just in the UK, there's been a court case brought by a female worker who took a well-known accountant to court, and the agency that employed her, because they were forcing her to wear high heels in the workplace. And she said, "Well, hang on a second, men don't walk around in 6-inch heels. Why should I?"
Yep.
And it went to court, and it's due. There's due to be a verdict on that. So it kind of brought it home. But what happens if a client says to you, "You're too young," or conversely, "You're too old"? How do you handle that, Ken?
I know, and I'm not going to put an answer in there because I guess it's going to be unique, and this is about getting that topic going and getting you thinking about it. And I guess it really keys into knowing yourself. And we're asked when we do counselling training to look at ourselves and do personal development, and that is such a vital part. Your PD session, your personal development session that you have with your peers. This is a great place. If you are feeling those insecurities, if you have had that confrontational wave coming from a client where you're feeling that judgment, or they've mentioned that judgment, to take it in. And it doesn't have to be age. It can be anything. It can be, you wouldn't be able to understand me because you're a man. It can be all of those things. And I don't have the answers, but I just know that the questions are there. And what is it? Socratic questioning, Rory, is kind of that good questions lead to just better questions, I guess, really.
Yes, as I always used to say to my students, "What's a Socratic question?" And they'd look at me and I'd say, "That was." It's a question that forces more questions.
Yeah.
And I think, a clear message to agencies. I can understand why people would be concerned on a very, very shallow level about taking people on because of age, someone who's too young. But here's the question, Ken. Does age necessarily bring wisdom? I've met some young people who are incredibly wise, who were. I can remember working particularly in a CPD session I did, a drama therapy. I did a little drama therapy course many years ago with a young woman from who's at Chester. I forget her name now, but what I do remember about her, she was just incredible, Ken. She was absolutely incredible. And not a question in my mind that when she qualified, she'd be an outstanding therapist. And I've worked with people who are older who kind of struggle along a bit and think that their view of the world is everybody else's.
Yeah.
And lots in between. And I'm not sure that age and experience is that useful to be a counsellor, because you're working in someone else's frame of reference.
100%.
It's not what you know and how you've lived your life. It's about what the client's saying to you and how you're integrating yourself into that frame of reference and working with it and picking up what that client's saying. And I have to say, Ken, that I've lived a long, at 58 years old, an interesting life. And I would say that virtually none of it is any use apart from my training.
Yes.
When I'm working with the client.
Yeah. And when you're saying that, we're speaking now specifically about age, and I recognize what you're saying. And I recognize as well that it can almost be a disadvantage when a client brings something that you relate to. We call it parallel process, when you're going, oh, that's actually like something that happened to me and an experience I've had in my life. Let me lead this client the way I went, or try and help them the way I was helped. That's not what we're there to do. It's not about what we can bring in our wisdom and our life experience. You're 100% correct, Rory. It is being able to be with them. So the counter argument to that is that you do need to know yourself, and you do need to be self-aware to be there. But we would hope that if you're on a counselling course and you're taking personal development seriously, your tutors are working with you on that. So an agency should accept, if you're coming from a reputable learning institution, that is in order. And look beyond the age, look beyond the colour, the religion, weight, whatever, all of those things that we study to look beyond as counsellors, as psychotherapists. So, yeah, I see it. It's tricky, though, I guess, because I guess it does exist. And when a client is coming in maybe and making a comment that hits, it's about your stuff. You're the counsellor. Take it to supervision. Take it to your own counselling. Go and work on that. Because if a client had to say to you, I can't work with you, you've got 3 arms. Well, it wouldn't hurt you emotionally, because you'd look down and go, well, no, I don't have 3 arms. You know yourself well enough to know that you don't have 3 arms. It is their stuff. It is their perception. But if they say, oh, I don't feel comfortable working with you, you're too young, I wonder, does that hurt? Yeah, and it's about looking at that and examining it. If you know yourself and you're comfortable in yourself, you can recognise that is from their frame of reference and only.
Yeah, and the same thing would go for being too old. I was a school counsellor, as you did, Ken. I was in my 40s. I finished a couple of years ago, so I was in my late 50s. And I did think at the time that being so old compared to the people I was working with, 3 times the lifetime in some cases, would have an effect. But, wasn't the experience. There were occasionally where the students I was working with, young people I was working with, would say, I don't want another adult telling me what to do. I think that was more about their perception of what counselling is than about me. But, I would say that we built really good relationships, and it was really about them, their space. And I think that's where the relationship lives. It lives within how they experience it.
Yes. And how you deal with it as a person. You're speaking about the counselling younger people and being an older person, which we clearly are when we're there. And it's about that acceptance of, this is good enough. I am good enough as I am. I don't need to change. And we spoke only recently in a very recent podcast episode about child and adolescent counselling and trying to get down and trying to speak the lingo and wear the clothes. And that is just incongruence. What is that about? Well, we obviously don't do that. And we were speaking about how we don't go there. It is just accepting you bring yourself to counselling. It is a relationship between 2 human beings within a room. That's what it is. It is.
And, in terms of rejection, I've never been rejected by a counselling client, but I did work with clients who'd come out of psychiatric care, long-term psychiatric care, as a support worker. And I went to a meeting once, and I can remember the person looking at me and saying, you're not going to be my support worker. Look at the size of you. And for those of you who only hear me on through the radio, I am bigger than the average bear, I would say. I'm quite a broad guy, quite a stocky fella. And he said, people will know exactly who you are walking down the street. And I just thought to myself, well, actually, that's just who I am. And that isn't going to change overnight. It's his choice. Yes. And I think I went and got myself another cup of tea and a donut, I think to remember.
That's it. That is it. As you've described it there, Rory, you very clearly saw that was his stuff, not your stuff. So I guess in a situation where if you ever find yourself in a kind of situation where that comes up, how would we work with that? Would we reflect back what the client is saying and saying, it seems to me, that you feel that I'm far too young, and I wonder what that's about for you, and just use the skills we use as a counsellor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the agencies, should be thoughtful when they are interviewing people, because the law clearly states that we don't discriminate against age, and the Equalities Act is very, very clear. And it's interesting because when I first started training, you couldn't train to be a counsellor at any level until you're 18. And that stopped, and you can now start at 16.
Yeah.
And the only caveat to that, if there's anybody 16 listening, is that you will probably be in a room with quite a lot of older people.
Yeah.
And, you'd have to think about how comfortable that is. But to be fair, some 16-year-olds are okay with that. And I've taught 16-year-olds, certainly at the school I counselled at, they were running counselling courses within the school, and it seemed to give the students great benefit. So, yeah, I think the message is that really agencies should give the same conditions, the core conditions to you as you're giving to your clients. And if they don't, I think you need to think about whether you want to work with them.
I agree, 100%. What a topic. Can continue this conversation. Get on the Facebook page. Let us know your thoughts on this. Let us know if you've ever been in a situation where you felt maybe judged for who you are. And of course, keep those boundaries of confidentiality. So we don't want to be bringing any client material in, but you can, of course, bring in a brief story of how that is for you. Just go and do that on the Facebook page. Love to see that conversation play out. But we're moving on now to Theory with Rory. We know the person-centered approach to counselling, Carl Rogers, identified 6 conditions that he saw as being necessary for a therapeutic relationship to take place. And we learn about those as the basics in person-centered therapy. However, a deeper dive today, Rory, into psychological contact.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? And I say it's interesting. It's a rhetorical question. I think it's interesting.
I like that.
It's a rhetorical question. I'm sure there are people out there saying, I don't think it's interesting at all, Rory, but it is interesting to me. And what strikes me is that, and I was guilty of this for a long time, being a bit kind of naive about what psychological contact is. And I've been recently doing some research on Roger's time at Wisconsin and the Psych Project, which he described as the worst experience of his professional life.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for that was he was working with people. It was called the Skitch Project. He was working with people with schizophrenia. And he really struggled with the medical model of mental health. He really struggled with that. And I might do another podcast on that one day. But the interesting thing was he did work with people with schizophrenia. And the overarching thing that came from Wisconsin was that it was about motivation, how motivated clients were. And here's the thing, the research that he produced at Wisconsin, which is his last posting before he found his spiritual home at the Western Behavioral Sciences Unit in La Jolla, where he stayed until his death, was that he discovered that actually there was very little difference between unmotivated clients who didn't have schizophrenia and unmotivated clients who did. It was all about the motivation.
Wow. And it's interesting you say that, because motivation does key in at 11 to that psychological context of how willing the client is. So without any further ado, let's do this deep dive and go straight into Theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees Oakes.
In 1957, Carl Rogers published an article in the Journal of Consulting Psychology entitled The Necessary and Sufficient Conditions of Therapeutic Personality Change. He outlines 6 conditions that must exist between a client and a therapist for therapy to be effective. 3 of these conditions, empathy, congruence and unconditional positive regard, became known as the core conditions, although it is worth noting that Rogers himself never referred to that term. Of those original 6 conditions, the first one, psychological contact, seems to get very little attention. In his 1957 paper, Rogers himself makes this brief observation. The first condition specifies that a minimal relationship, a psychological contact, must exist. I am hypothesizing that a significant positive personality change does not occur except in a relationship. This is, of course, a hypothesis, and it may be disproved. So, what is psychological contact and what form may it take in the therapy room? To try to answer this, I will share an observation from a recent trip to Ireland. I was invited to give a guest lecture to some first and second year diploma students, some of whom who are already in practice and some of whom who are about to embark on their practice journey. One student asked, If I ask a client how do they feel and they reply, I don't know, could I get them to think of a colour to help identify an emotion? I inquired why she'd asked the question, and the reply was that she was not sure if this was person-centred or not. My view is that psychological contact is really multi-layered, and for this condition to be met, the therapist needs to pay attention to a number of elements in the relationship. The first is that the client understands where they are and what they have come for. Now, this may seem quite basic. However, for clients who have attended under the influence of alcohol or drugs, this could be an issue. Some prescription medications can leave individuals disconnected and disorientated. In cases like this, a therapist needs to take a view if the client understands what they're engaging in, especially at the contracting stage. Some agencies who support clients in recovery from addiction state in the policies that anyone attending counselling should not have used or drank prior to the session. The second type of psychological contact is language. Does the client understand you, and do you understand them? More to the point, is your understanding of the language enough to create a relationship where the client feels heard and understood? The third type of psychological contact is motivation. Is the client coming to you for therapy or for another outcome? For instance, a client believes you can give legal or medical advice. The fourth type of psychological contact is around building a common therapeutic language. For example, a client who uses metaphor or simile may very well feel more connected psychologically with a therapist who understands and works with metaphor. This may take some time as the therapist gets to know the client's way of expressing themselves. However, once this is understood, the client and the therapist could get on like a house on fire. Did you see what I did there? To use a well-known English metaphor. It can also be about the client's working style, which brings me back to the student who asked about colours and my reply, which was that if a client experiences their world in terms of colour, sound or touch, then the best connection the therapist can make is by adopting the client's preference, and that will always be person-centred. So what other barriers are there to psychological contact? Well, I'm going to be very careful and measured in this last response. Some psychological difficulties that clients can have, such as schizophrenia or bipolar, can sometimes put them in a position where they're not connected to the world as we see it. In cases like this, clients may benefit from some other form of support. However, having bipolar or having schizophrenia shouldn't debar a client from receiving counselling, as long as both them and the therapist are in the same psychological space and observing the same reality.
As always, Rory, so interested. And you can, of course, get the handout that Rory has made. It's a sizzler, I have been told. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's counselling with 2 L's because we're based in the UK. It's the UK spelling. Counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab. Go to episode number 35. And it's right there at the top of the page. You just click on the link and you can download Rory's handout on that. Thank you very much. I found that really interesting, and from my own training and background, I worked in drug and alcohol services for some years, and one of the conditions in the contract when working with clients is that they would not be under the influence of drugs or alcohol when they attended therapy, and that wasn't as a punishment. It wasn't because it means you're now taking drugs again. It was because psychological contact was impaired, and that you would cover in that session would be so watered down if it hit home at all. So great topic. Thank you.
Yes, and hopefully people now will be thinking about what psychological contact means, and also, making reference to the new modality that's used with people with Alzheimer's or memory loss, which is validation therapy, which is really interesting. So we're going to move on again now, Ken.
Yes.
Because again, from our Facebook page, we're very grateful to Claire Haynes, who is a level 3 student, who's written about crying in the therapy room. Now, this is the client, not the therapist,
Yeah.
make that clear. And how do you respond? And what do we do? It's interesting, isn't it, Ken?
Oh, this is this is like our first topic, in that you can really go in so many different directions. There's so many different thoughts on this as well. So what does it mean? So is crying welcomed within, well, I guess for me, and I can just speak for me and my practice, is that when we're counselling, we're working in emotion, and crying is an emotion. It is emotion that we know is a base emotion. So if we look to a baby, a newborn baby, when it is unfiltered, will cry. And I guess there are some people that go through life where they hear the message very strongly, very clearly, that crying is a weakness and that emotion is kind of buried down and maybe doesn't show often, or when it does show, brings up feelings within them of, look at me, I'm crying. And sometimes within my own room, a client may have tears in their eyes and they will say, I'm so sorry, I'm crying, and they'll apologize for those tears. And the way that I work with that is I very softly and very gently say, all of your emotions are welcome here. But I got tissue boxes in my therapy room, and there are therapists who would consider that an indication that this is a place you are going to cry. I don't know. How is it for you? Do you have a tissue box around, Rory?
I always have a tissue box. I hire rooms in my private practice, and the receptionist very kindly put my name on the box on my tissue, so I had to take it off. Rory's crying box was the message.
Oh my goodness!
Thank you so much to these super people there, but it was just one of those things that a therapist would pick up on, but maybe not someone who wasn't a therapist. I think you have to be careful with the tissues, because I remember a student waxing lyrical about going to see a therapist, and the therapist shoving a box of tissues towards her with her index finger, and the subtext is, right, well, it's crying time now, so you can get on with that crying. That'd be lovely. Yeah. And then we get that out of the way, and then we move to something else. So I always have the arm's length rule. So it has to be, I measure from my elbow to my hand from the client's seat where they can put it on, and then they can reach for the tissues, and if they want them, it's fine. In terms of crying, well, I think that it's a real privilege to sit with someone with that emotion. It's not, it might not be good for them, but is it? Because I've had clients through the years who've just said, that feels so good.
Oh yes.
It feels so good to cry. And I can remember one, without kind of outing the client, but I can remember one session where I had someone I was working with, I'll choose my words carefully here, who was absolutely sobbing their heart out. And I just said, you're not on your own.
That is so powerful, Rory. And, when I hear something like you've just shared there, it is, for me, it's a testament to the conditions that were available within that room, that the client felt that safety. Because there is, I guess, this thing, you don't want to be seen crying by other people, and it's something we want to do behind closed doors. And I'm not generalizing here. I'm just kind of throwing lines in, because that is, of course, not true for everybody. But it can be for some. And being able to let your emotions, which we all have, out, it means that you're safe, and it means that you're okay to do that. And how do we give that permission? Well, I guess the permission is not ours to give, it's the client's to take. But how do we give that message that, yes, if your emotions are welcome here, without saying, well, here you go, box of tissues, off, like you were speaking about. That it's tricky.
It is, and it's about, it's as always, and I speak as someone who works deeply with a person-centered basis in my practice, it is about those conditions. It's about providing, as Roger's described, the soil of a different kind. Yeah. And I don't think it's quantifiable. I don't think you can sit there and say, well, there's the permission there, there's the permission there. I think it's about that back and forward of the relationship, that frame of reference.
Yeah.
We talked about at the beginning of the podcast, and trust, all massive trust. The client trusts you to be able to do that. So incredible.
I'll share a technique. I guess it's a technique, and it didn't start off as a technique. It's just something that has developed. So I guess it's a way that I work with somebody within my private practice. So I have the tissue boxes. They kind of they're not disguised, but they're not bright yellow and shining. They're on a wooden small table, and the tissues are inside a little holding box, which is also wood, with the tissue pulled out, so you can clearly see that it is tissues. And I never draw attention to the tissues. And if a client is brought to tears, I never say, there's tissues over there if you like, because they know there are tissues over there. They can see them. They're very clearly there. So I don't interrupt that process. And I don't know if that's good or bad or what it is, but that's the way that I've found it, is to just leave. And sometimes a client will have the tears rolling, and when we cry, the mucus flows. It's the way it is. And not take a tissue. And that's their choice. The tissues are right there. And it is not for me to jump in and, would you like a tissue, or hand them a tissue, or direct them to the tissue. Just interested. Tissue box management. I think there's a thesis in there somewhere, Rory.
I think there's a master's degree waiting to be written, or a PhD boiling away in the background on that. But I think it is interesting, and it is a topic that through the years has come up time and time again. Crying, tissues, how to respond to it. And I guess as we come kind of to the end of this topic, one of the dangers that we could have is to put our rescuing mode in and go down that. It'll be all right. Or even worse, Ken's wincing. You can't see him, but Ken's wincing at the other end of the studio screen. Or even worse, saying, don't cry, don't cry. And I think that I've seen this in training groups, I have to say, and I've said my response is always to the person who says, "Don't cry. How do you feel about crying?" And it's always, well, I don't like it. I say, yeah, that's your frame of reference.
And that's it. Here's the question as we come to the end of this topic. How do you feel about crying? What does it bring up for you when people around you cry? What is that emotion? Because that's for you to look at. And you're 100% right. And watch somebody cry on television, and there'll be somebody standing by saying, "Oh, no, don't worry. Stop crying. It's all going to be okay. Come here. Oh, come on. Stop crying now." It's interesting that society has become that way, that there are certain emotions that are welcomed and encouraged. Oh, you're having a good laugh. Come on. Yeah, hey, that's great. What? You're crying? What? You're depressed? You've got to get out of that. It's interesting that the rainbow of human emotions is not valued equally, yet we experience them equally. And it is likely that you're going to see crying as a counsellor. And how do you feel about that? And the thing that came up to me, we're talking about tissues and management and them being there and what message that gives. What message does it give if they're not there? And I don't know. Does it give the message of, yeah, it's right, you don't cry, you hold it inside, because that's brave and strong? Wow. This is a deep topic, a deep topic.
It is, Ken, and it brings us to the end of this episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And it's been a great episode. We talked about frame of reference at the beginning. We also talked about equality and diversity, something that's just so important. And it's a byword for what we do as therapists. I've talked about frame of reference and its psychological contact within frame of reference. Yeah. Little interest in there, and free handout. Don't forget, get your free handout. And then finally, we've talked about crying in the therapy room. Fantastic episode, Ken.
It's been a privilege to be here. And again, just back to where we started at the beginning, I'm just so grateful that you chose to listen to this. And if you take a moment to go and leave us an iTunes review, wow, grateful. Just gratitude. My word for the day.
That'd be lovely. Yeah, we'd be very grateful of that, and we're very grateful for all the people who put such positive things in all our social media feeds. So until the next time, and as always, stay grounded.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.